My husband's body wasn't even cold when his brother leaned in to ask me about the house. I was still in my funeral dress, the black silk scratching against my neck like a hair shirt, sitting in our front parlour with a cup of tea that had gone stone cold on the side table. The church ladies were still murmuring in the hallway, a sea of dark suits and whispered condolences, when Walter pulled a chair too close to mine. The legs scraping against the hardwood floor Harold had insisted on refinishing just last spring. He lowered his voice, dropping it to that conspiratorial whisper men use when they think they're doing a woman a favour, and asked, "Did he ever change the deed, Ruth?" I looked at him like he had spoken a language I hadn't heard in decades, something foreign and sharp. I blinked, my mind still foggy from the funeral service, from the organ music that had seemed too loud for the small sanctuary, from the overwhelming scent of lilies that was already starting to make the house smell like a mausoleum. Walter tapped his temple with a thick finger, a gesture so patronizing it made my stomach turn in ways that had nothing to do with grief. "You know," he whispered, offering a tight, oily smile that never quite reached his eyes, "in case you ever need help managing things. Legally speaking, we need to be practical, Ruth. Harold would have wanted us to be practical. Now, understand this. My husband had been in the ground less than 5 hours. The dirt was still fresh on Harold's grave, dark and moist from the morning rain. The flowers from our church congregation hadn't even begun to wilt in the October chill. And here was his brother circling like a vulture before the sun had even set, talking about deeds and management and legalities, as if Harold's death was nothing more than a business transaction that needed proper filing. Everyone thought I was in shock. They looked at me with those pitying eyes, heads tilted at just the right angle of sympathy, nodding at each other behind my back, whispering, "She's numb with grief, poor soul," or "She's absolutely devastated. How will she manage?" I had stood next to the casket earlier that day, accepting cold hands and murmured platitudes from our church congregation, from neighbours who had known us for decades, from Harold's colleagues at the bank, where he had worked for 37 years. "He was such a godly man," they said, their voices hushed with the reverence reserved for the recently departed. "He adored you," they lied with practiced ease. "You must be completely lost without him. What will you do now?" And I nodded. Lord help me, I played my part perfectly. I was the grieving widow, the small, fragile woman left behind, suddenly adrift in a world too complicated for her simple understanding. I accepted their casseroles and their phone numbers, their offers to help with the difficult decisions that lay ahead. But the truth was something I hadn't even admitted to myself until Walter tapped his temple with that condescending gesture. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't lost. For the first time in 52 years, I was free. I just didn't know it yet. That evening, when the last church member had finally pulled away in their sensible sedan, and the quiet came crashing back into the house like a wave, I didn't go to bed. The silence felt different somehow. Not oppressive, as it had been for so many years, but expectant, waiting. I walked the length of the hallway like a stranger in my own life, my footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors. I looked at the rugs I had vacuumed for 40 years, the heavy burgundy curtains I had sewn myself back in the early 80s, when such things mattered to Harold, when my domestic skills were still worth commenting upon. The chipped teacup on the kitchen counter that Harold hated because it didn't match the bone china set from his mother. the set we used only for Christmas and Easter, and the occasional visit from the pastor. It all looked the same, yet it felt different, hollow, almost echoing, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I was still in that black dress, my feet aching in the low heels I rarely wore, the ones Harold had picked out because they were appropriate for a woman of my age and station. And without really planning to, without any conscious decision, my body took me to the one door I had never dared to touch in 52 years of marriage. His office. It had always been locked, always. In the early years of our marriage, he told me it was because of client confidentiality. He was a banker, a loan officer, a man of importance in our small town of Millbrook. "You wouldn't understand the financial documents, Ruthie," he would say, patting my hand like I was a child who had asked too many questions about grown-up things. "Don't fuss with it. That's not your concern." I believed him then, because back then I believed that love meant trust, and trust meant not asking questions, not pushing boundaries, not insisting on answers to things that made my husband's jaw tighten in that particular way. I believed that a good Christian wife supported her husband's work without interference. That curiosity was a form of disrespect, that my role was to maintain the home while he maintained our place in the world. But even after he retired 5 years ago, even after there were no more clients to protect, no more confidential files to secure, the door stayed locked. He would go in there after dinner, sometimes staying for hours, while I cleaned the kitchen and folded laundry and watched the evening news alone. I would hear him talking to himself through the heavy wood, low and rhythmic, like he was practicing a presentation or rehearsing an argument. Sometimes I would catch fragments of words, my own name mixed in with numbers and what sounded like medical terminology. But whenever I asked about it, he would emerge looking irritated, as if I had interrupted something important. Once, about 10 years ago, I had gathered enough courage to ask him directly what he was working on in there, what could possibly require so much time and secrecy. He turned to me, his face cold and smooth, as a stone pulled from deep water, and said, "That's not for you, Ruth. That is my world. You have the rest of the house." The finality in his voice, the way he dismissed me so completely, made me feel small in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood, when my father would send me away from adult conversations with the same tone of absolute authority. I stood in front of that door now, my palm pressed against the cool wood. It was plain walnut, dark and serious, with a brass handle that shone under the hallway light. Harold had insisted on keeping dim for ambience. Nothing remarkable about it, except that it was the only part of this house. The house I cleaned every day, the house I maintained and decorated and turned into a home. That didn't belong to me. Even our bedroom felt more mine than his, filled as it was with my quilts and my books, and the small watercolour paintings I had done in those first hopeful years of marriage, before Harold gently suggested that art was a nice hobby, but not practical for a banker's wife. I could almost hear his voice from the other side of that door. "That's not for you, Ruth. Go rest, Ruth. You're getting confused again, Ruth." How many times had he said those words? How many times had he told me my memory was slipping when I questioned household expenses? Or that I was overreacting when I mentioned feeling lonely? Or that I needed to take one of the little blue pills Dr. Fielding prescribed to settle my nerves when I became what Harold called agitated? The next morning dawned grey and cold, typical for late October in our part of Minnesota. I didn't call Walter as his pointed questions had suggested I should. I didn't call our children either. Janet in Seattle with her busy law practice, or Michael in Chicago with his growing family. They were grieving their father in their own way, remembering the man who had coached Michael's little league team and walked Janet down the aisle with such obvious pride. I couldn't bear to shatter their memories. Not yet. Not when I wasn't even sure what I would find behind that locked door. Instead, I went to the kitchen drawer where Harold kept the phone book, found the number for a local locksmith, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. The young woman on the phone was kind and professional, not asking why a widow would need to break into a room in her own house. Perhaps it was more common than I thought, this need to unlock secrets after death. The locksmith arrived promptly at 2:00. A polite man in his 40s named Pete, who wore clean work clothes and carried his tools in a case that looked more like a doctor's bag than anything mechanical. He studied the lock with the focused attention of a surgeon, examining a patient, whistling low under his breath. "Old mechanism," he said, running his fingers along the brass fittings. "Good quality, though. Hasn't been changed in years, maybe decades. These were built to last, not like the cheap stuff they make now." "No," I said, watching him work with steady hands. "Control doesn't evolve. It calcifies." He glanced at me with surprise, perhaps not expecting philosophy from a grieving widow. But he didn't comment. His tools made small, precise sounds. Clicking, scraping, the whisper of metal against metal. It took him 15 minutes of careful work before I heard it. That sharp metal snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. The sound of something giving way after decades of resistance. My heart hammered against my ribs as the door creaked open on hinges that protested with age. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not mildew, but something more complex and unsettling. It was the smell of age and secrets, dust and leather, old paper, and something faintly medicinal, like antiseptic that had soured over time. I paid Pete and waited, standing in the hallway with my arms wrapped around myself, until I heard his truck pull away. Only then did I step inside. The room was immaculate in a way that made my skin crawl. I don't know what I had expected. Chaos, perhaps? A mess of important papers. But this was terrified order, the kind of organization that speaks to obsession rather than efficiency. A large oak desk sat in the center, like an altar, its surface cleared except for a single green banker's lamp that cast everything in an eerie, underwater light. Bookshelves lined every wall, but they weren't filled with novels or histories, or any of the books that might feed a man's soul. Instead, there were identical black binders and thick manila folders, arranged with military precision. A leather chair worn into the exact shape of Harold's body faced the single window that looked out onto our backyard, where I could see the bird feeder I filled every morning and the small garden where I grew herbs and tomatoes, despite his complaints about the neighbors' opinions. Everything in this room was positioned with purpose. Nothing casual or comfortable about it. But it was the labels that made me stop breathing altogether. Every shelf, every binder, every box had been marked with Harold's precise handwriting, and as I stepped closer, squinting through my reading glasses, I saw my name appearing again and again. RAT Medical Records, RAT Financial Monitoring, RAT Correspondence Files, RAT, Behavioral Documentation. RAT, Ruth Adelaide Thornton. He had reduced me to initials, like a laboratory specimen or a case study. I stood there, my hand still gripping the brass door handle so tightly my knuckles had gone white, staring into a space that had been forbidden to me for half a century. And now it was mine to explore, mine to understand. But looking at those endless files dedicated to documenting my existence, it didn't feel like a gift or an inheritance. It felt like standing at the edge of a grave, my own grave, and being invited to look down into the darkness. The room seemed to whisper with Harold's voice. "Go on, Ruth. See what I really thought of you. See how carefully I watched. See how well I knew you, better than you knew yourself. I wasn't ready for that revelation, not yet." The weight of 52 years of marriage, of trust and doubt and small humiliations, pressed down on me like a physical thing. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart racing like a bird trapped against glass, and I closed the door behind me. But I didn't lock it. I couldn't have locked it even if I'd wanted to. Pete had taken the mechanism apart, leaving only the smooth brass handle and the promise of access whenever I found the courage to return. I left it slightly ajar instead, just a crack of darkness visible in the hallway, like a wound that had been opened and was now breathing in the light. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Harold and I had shared for over 5 decades, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence that felt different now, pregnant with possibility rather than oppression. The house settled around me, with its familiar creaks and sighs. But underneath those normal sounds, I could swear I heard something else. The whisper of papers rustling, the soft click of file drawers, as if the office itself was calling to me. I kept thinking that door would swing open on its own, that some ghost of Harold would emerge from that forbidden room and sit on the edge of our bed to explain everything away with his practiced patience. "It's for your own good, Ruth. You know how you get when you're overtired. You're imagining things that aren't there." But nothing came except the wind, rattling our bedroom windows and the distant sound of a train whistle from the tracks that ran along the edge of town. By morning, I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes not from physical exertion, but from the weight of knowledge you're not sure you want to carry. I made coffee in the percolator Harold had insisted was better than any of those new automatic machines, though my hands shook as I measured the grounds. I stood in front of the hallway mirror in my blue terry cloth bathrobe and barely recognized the woman staring back at me, hair like melted silver, pulled back in the neat bun Harold preferred, thin lips pressed together in a line that spoke of years of biting back words. But there was something different in my eyes now, a spark of defiance I hadn't seen since I was young, since before I learned that a good wife keeps her questions to herself. "Who are you?" I wondered, touching my reflection with fingertips that trembled slightly from arthritis rather than fear. "Who have you become while he was watching you so carefully?" By 10 o'clock, I couldn't stand the suspense any longer. I walked back down that hallway, my slippers silent on the hardwood, and pushed the door open all the way. Natural light flooded in, making the dust motes dance like tiny spirits, and I stepped fully into Harold's secret world. I went straight to the desk this time, drawn by what I now recognized as a kind of altar to his obsession. Under a heavy crystal paperweight, a retirement gift from the bank that I had never seen before, sat a cream-coloured envelope with my name written in Harold's precise script. Ruth Adelaide My fingers felt stiff and clumsy as I opened it, arthritis making the simple task more difficult than it should have been. There was no letter inside, no final words of love or explanation, no apology for the secrets. Instead, there was a single sheet of white paper typed with the same mechanical precision Harold brought to everything in his life. The header read, "Instructions for Ruth Adelaide upon my death. Contact Walter immediately to handle all financial accounts. Do not attempt to access office files without legal supervision. All estate matters will be resolved through the family trust. Continue medical treatment as previously arranged by Dr. Fielding. All major decisions regarding the property to be coordinated through executor. Avoid stress and overstimulation. Focus on familiar routines. Take prescribed medications as directed." I read it twice, then a third time, each word hitting me like a small, precise blow. Avoid stress. Take medications. Do not attempt to access. Even in death, Harold was still managing me, still assuming I would obey his instructions without question, still treating me like a patient rather than his widow. I sat down heavily in his leather chair, feeling it conform to my smaller frame in a way that felt both foreign and oddly liberating. The leather creaked with a sound I had heard 1,000 times from the hallway, but never from this perspective. I let the instruction sheet slide from my hands to the Persian rug Harold had inherited from his mother, a woman who had never particularly liked me, but had tolerated me as suitable for her son. He had planned this moment, I realized. He had sat in this very chair, probably while I was in the kitchen preparing his dinner, and composed these final commands. He had orchestrated his departure just as carefully as he had orchestrated our entire marriage, leaving nothing to chance, nothing to my own judgment. But I wasn't following instructions anymore. I opened the top drawer of the desk with hands that had stopped trembling. Inside were neat manila folders arranged alphabetically, like patient files from his banking days. I pulled one at random. RAT Medical Monitoring. The label was written in Harold's careful script, and beneath it, someone, Harold himself, had added smaller notations. Ongoing documentation and behavioral correlations. Inside the folder were photocopies of prescriptions going back 15 years, medications I recognized and some I didn't, anti-anxiety drugs, sleep aids, mild sedatives that Dr. Fielding had prescribed for what Harold described as my episodes. There were notes in Harold's handwriting in the margins. Observations that made my skin crawl. Increased dosage if questioning behavior returns. Subject responds well to routine disruption therapy. Monitor for signs of independent thinking. Subject? I whispered to the empty room. What kind of husband calls his wife a subject? I remembered the years these prescriptions covered. I had been going through what I now understood was a perfectly normal period of questioning, wondering why I wasn't allowed to have my own checking account, why Harold answered the phone when my sister called, why I felt so tired all the time. I had mentioned these concerns to Dr. Fielding during what I thought were routine checkups, never realizing that Harold was sitting in on those appointments, taking notes, describing my perfectly reasonable questions as symptoms of mental instability. I pulled another file. Correspondence surveillance. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Inside were photocopies of letters. My letters. The ones I had written to my sister Catherine in Portland, to my old friend Dorothy, whom I had lost touch with years ago when Harold suggested she was a bad influence. Even birthday cards I had mailed to our grandchildren, every single one, had been opened and copied before being mailed. Harold had been intercepting my thoughts, my private words, studying them like a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. Some letters had notes attached in his writing, concerning tone regarding household finances, mentions feeling isolated, monitor social interactions, questioning established routines, consider medication adjustment. He had been reading my mail for decades. He had been studying my private thoughts, analyzing my emotions like data points in some twisted research project. This wasn't protection or concern. This was surveillance, pure and simple. I felt sick, a cold nausea that started in my stomach and spread outward until even my fingertips felt clammy. I moved to the bookshelves, pulling down binder after binder. Behavioral Documentation 2019. Schedule Monitoring 2021. Social Interaction Logs. Each one contained detailed observations of my daily life, written in Harold's clinical handwriting, as if I were a laboratory animal being studied, rather than his wife of 52 years. June the 3rd. Ruth remained at grocery store 47 minutes longer than usual. Claimed she encountered Mrs. Peterson from church, but seemed nervous when questioned. Monitor for signs of unauthorized social contact. September 14th. Refused evening medication. Became argumentative about attending Wednesday prayer meeting. Demonstrated concerning independence. Implemented routine disruption protocol. October the 2nd. Cried during breakfast for no apparent reason. When questioned, claimed I had forgotten her birthday. Emotional instability increasing. Consider Dr. Fielding consultation. I slammed the binder shut, my voice cracking as I spoke to the empty room. I wasn't having an emotional breakdown. You did forget my birthday, you controlling monster. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny accusations in the air. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of Harold's systematic demolition of my selfhood. This wasn't a husband's study. It was a case file, a legal brief he had been building against me, piece by piece, year by year, to prove to anyone who might ask that I was incompetent, unreliable, a woman who needed constant management. And the most damning realization was that I had helped him. Every time I stayed silent when he dismissed my concerns, every time I apologized for being difficult, every time I accepted his explanations for why I couldn't manage my own life, I had handed him another piece of evidence for his case against my sanity. But Harold had made one crucial error. Behind a landscape painting of a peaceful meadow, ironic given the chaos it concealed, I found a small wall safe. The combination was easy to guess once I understood his mind. Our wedding date, 06/17/71. Inside were 3 items that would change everything. The first was a completed legal document. Petition for declaration of mental incompetency. Ruth Adelaide Thornton. It was signed, notarized, and dated just 6 months before Harold's death. He had been preparing to have me declared legally incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs. There were supporting statements from doctors I barely remembered meeting, including Dr. Fielding, who had apparently concluded I was suffering from progressive cognitive decline and emotional instability. The second document was Harold's actual will, not the simple version our family attorney had read, but a comprehensive 23-page document that placed everything in a trust controlled by Walter. I wouldn't own my own home, wouldn't have access to my own money, wouldn't even be allowed to make medical decisions without approval from Harold's chosen guardian. But it was the third item that broke something loose inside me. A handwritten note in Harold's precise script. Ruth, in case you ever find this room, you should know that every decision I made was for your protection. You were never capable of understanding the complexities of real life. I gave you purpose and structure. Without my guidance, you would have been lost years ago. Even in death, he was gaslighting me. Even after I had discovered his surveillance system, his manipulation, his planned theft of my autonomy, he was still telling me it was for my own good. I called my old friend Dorothy that evening. We hadn't spoken in 8 years. Harold had gradually made it clear that he disapproved of her influence on me, and eventually it had become easier to let the friendship fade than to fight about it. Ruth, Dorothy's voice was cautious when she answered. I heard about Harold's passing. I wasn't sure if I should call. Dorothy, I found Harold's files, I said without preamble. All of them. A long pause, then softly. Oh, honey. So you finally discovered the room. You knew? I suspected something. You used to be so bright, so curious about everything. Then gradually, you became so careful, like you were walking on eggshells all the time. When I tried to visit, Harold would answer the door and explain you weren't feeling well. When I called, he would take messages, but you rarely called back. I told her everything. The surveillance, the medical manipulation, the planned declaration of incompetency. When I finished, Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Ruth, she finally said, her voice strong and clear. You're not crazy. You never were. What you're describing isn't love or protection. It's abuse. And honey, you don't have to accept his final verdict on your life. The legal battle took 8 months, but we won. Attorney George Hoffman, who specialized in elder abuse cases, was appalled by the evidence. Mrs. Thornton, he said during our first meeting, your husband constructed what we call a legal cage, a system designed to strip away your rights without due process, relying entirely on your compliance and silence. The judge, a woman about my daughter's age, listened to the evidence with growing horror. When she declared the incompetency petition fraudulent and dissolved Harold's trust, restoring my full legal rights, I felt something inside me uncurl for the first time in decades. I transformed Harold's office into a bright sewing room with butter-yellow walls and sheer curtains that let in floods of natural light. Where his files once stood, I installed shelves for my quilting supplies and the watercolor paints I hadn't touched in 30 years. Last month, I hosted my 3rd workshop at the church library, Reclaiming Your Voice, a support group for women. 15 women attended, ranging in age from 45 to 82. We drink tea and speak truths that have been locked away for too long. One woman asked, Ruth, after all those years he stole, aren't you angry? I thought about it carefully before answering. I was furious, I said, but anger is just another way of letting him control my emotions. I'd rather use my energy to help other women find their voices. I looked around at their faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, all of them recognizing something of themselves in my story. If this sounds familiar to any of you, if you have someone in your life telling you you're too old, too confused, too emotional to understand important things, listen to me. Trust your instincts. Ask the hard questions. They'll call you difficult. They'll call you ungrateful. But that's just the sound of control losing its grip. I am 72 years old. My hair is silver. My hands are spotted with age. And I live alone. But I am not lonely. And I am not lost. I am exactly where I belong. In my own life, making my own choices, with my own key to every door. Come home to yourself. The door is unlocked. You just have to be brave enough to turn the handle.